There is a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the narcissist realizes something has changed. Not because you announced it, not because you argued or demanded or finally stood up in the way movies dramatize. It happens when you stop trying, when your voice no longer carries urgency, when your explanations grow shorter, your reactions flatter, and your emotional energy simply isn't there anymore. This is the moment control begins to slip, and it terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. You see, narcissistic control is not built on dominance alone. It is built on engagement, on your reactions, your questions, your emotional investment. They expect resistance. They expect tears. They even expect anger. What they do not expect is neutrality. Indifference disrupts the entire system. When you stop responding the way you used to, their internal radar starts scanning for danger. Something feels off, something feels unstable, and they don't yet know what it is, but they feel it deeply. At first, they may not even consciously register that you've given up. Instead, they experience a vague unease. Conversations feel flatter, their words don't land the way they used to. The emotional tug-of-war they relied on suddenly has no rope. This is profoundly disorienting because narcissistic individuals depend on external feedback to regulate their sense of self. Without your emotional cues, they feel untethered. They may repeat themselves, escalate small provocations, or poke at old wounds, not because they want resolution, but because they are checking to see if they can still move you. And when they realize they can't, that's when the panic sets in. What's important to understand is that this moment is not about love or loss in the way most people experience it. It's about control. When you disengage emotionally, you remove the mirror they use to see themselves. Your reactions once confirmed their power, their importance, their relevance. Without that reflection, they feel diminished, invisible, uncertain. And for someone whose identity is built on being central, being needed, being dominant, that uncertainty is intolerable. This is why they may suddenly become hyper-aware of you. They watch more closely. They analyze your tone. They replay conversations in their head, trying to pinpoint when things shifted. You may notice them asking strange questions, making unexpected comments, or testing boundaries in subtle ways. They are trying to regain footing, to reestablish the familiar rhythm where they provoke and you respond, where they destabilize and you explain. But you don't. And that silence, that emotional stillness, is louder than any argument you ever had. This is also the stage where many survivors doubt themselves. You might wonder if you're being cold, unfair, or dramatic. You might feel guilty for not engaging the way you used to. But what you are actually doing is something incredibly powerful. You are no longer volunteering your nervous system for someone else's regulation. You are no longer participating in a cycle that drained you. And the narcissist feels that loss immediately, even if they can't articulate it. They often interpret this shift as a threat rather than a boundary. Because in their world, relationships are about leverage, not mutuality. When you stop reacting, you are no longer predictable. And unpredictability equals danger. This is the moment their illusion of permanence, the belief that you would always be there, always explain, always try, starts to crack. This recognition sets everything else in motion. Confusion follows, then desperation, then attempts to pull you back in. But it all begins here, in this quiet withdrawal, not with drama, not with closure, but with you choosing not to give what was never truly reciprocated. And the truth is simple and unsettling for them. The moment you stopped trying to be understood was the moment they realized they were losing you, and control never survives that realization. Once that first realization settles in, that unsettling sense that something has shifted, the narcissist enters a deeply uncomfortable psychological space. This is where confusion takes over. Not ordinary confusion, but a kind of ego dissonance that feels almost unbearable. Because in their internal world, this was never supposed to happen. You were supposed to stay engaged. You were supposed to keep explaining, reacting, adjusting, and trying. Your quiet withdrawal doesn't fit the script they wrote, and when reality contradicts that script, the mind scrambles to protect itself. At this stage, they begin asking a silent question over and over again: how could this be happening if I'm still the same? Narcissistic structures are built on the belief that they are exceptional, indispensable, and immune to rejection. So when you give up, it creates a crack in that belief system. But instead of looking inward, they look for ways to dismiss or distort what's happening. Self-reflection would require accountability, and that feels far too threatening. So denial steps in. They may convince themselves that you're just tired, stressed, distracted, that you'll snap out of it. Or they may minimize your importance altogether, telling themselves you never really mattered that much anyway. This is not confidence. It's psychological self-protection. Their ego cannot tolerate the idea that they could be losing control or relevance, so it rewrites the narrative in real time. You might hear comments that feel dismissive or oddly detached. Things like, "You've changed," or "You're being dramatic," or "I don't know what your problem is." These statements aren't about understanding you. They are attempts to stabilize themselves. By framing you as the problem, they can preserve the fantasy that nothing is wrong with them. Blame becomes a soothing mechanism. At the same time, there's an internal tug of war happening. Part of them senses the loss. They feel the emotional distance. They notice that their words don't land, that their usual tactics don't spark the same response. But another part of them refuses to accept it. This contradiction creates intense psychological discomfort. And because they lack the emotional tools to sit with that discomfort, they often externalize it. This is why this phase can feel so strange to be around. Their behavior may become inconsistent. One moment they act indifferent, even superior. The next, oddly reactive or irritable. You might feel like you're walking on unstable ground, unsure which version you'll encounter. What you're witnessing is not confidence, it's fragmentation. Their internal story is no longer holding together cleanly. And here's the key thing to understand. This confusion is not about missing you as a person. It's about losing the role you played in maintaining their identity. You were a source of emotional regulation, validation, and control. When that source weakens, their sense of self wobbles. But instead of acknowledging that dependence, they experience it as an attack on their ego. This is also where gaslighting often intensifies. They may question your memory, your motives, your perception of events, not because they are trying to understand, but because destabilizing you helps them feel less destabilized. If they can make you doubt yourself, they can restore a sense of psychological dominance. But if you remain grounded, their confusion deepens. For survivors, this stage can be emotionally tempting. You may feel pulled to clarify, to explain yourself one last time, to make them get it. But this is the trap. Explanation feeds the very dynamic you're trying to leave. Their confusion is not a misunderstanding. It's a refusal to accept a reality that doesn't center them. What's actually happening is that their internal structure is starting to fracture. The story they told themselves about who they are and how relationships work is no longer matching their lived experience. And that gap between fantasy and reality is where the collapse quietly accelerates. Because when someone cannot tolerate the truth that you are no longer invested, they are forced to confront something far more threatening than abandonment, the possibility that they were never in control to begin with. As that confusion intensifies and denial can no longer fully hold things together, the narcissist moves into a phase that feels dramatic, urgent, and often incredibly convincing. This is where desperation shows up. The loss of emotional supply begins to feel real, and when that happens, the nervous system goes into survival mode. What you see next is not growth, insight, or emotional awakening. It is an attempt to stop the bleeding. Suddenly, the person who dismissed your feelings now wants to talk. The one who avoided accountability now wants closure. The distance you created triggers a rush of attention that may feel flattering, confusing, or even hopeful. This is where the texts get longer. The tone softens. The charm returns. They may reference shared memories, inside jokes, or moments of vulnerability. They may even acknowledge pain, yours or theirs, in a way they never have before. And this is where many people get pulled back in, because on the surface, it looks like change. They sound reflective. They may apologize, they might say things you've been waiting years to hear, but it's important to understand what's actually driving this behavior. This is not empathy, this is not insight, this is panic. When a narcissist senses the loss of supply, the goal becomes very simple: restore connection at any cost. This is what's often called hoovering, attempts to pull you back into the dynamic through affection, guilt, fear, or obligation. They may suddenly present themselves as wounded, misunderstood, or on the brink of collapse. You might hear things like, "I can't lose you," or "You're the only one who understands me," or "I'll do anything to fix this." These statements are designed to trigger your empathy, not reflect true accountability. You may also notice performative change, promises of therapy, declarations of self-awareness, sudden interest in your needs. But notice how fast it appears and how closely it follows your withdrawal. Real change is slow, uncomfortable, and consistent. This is fast, dramatic, and emotionally loaded. It's meant to create urgency so you don't have time to think. What's happening internally is that their sense of self is destabilizing. Without your attention, they feel exposed, empty, anxious. And rather than sit with that discomfort, they look for the fastest way to regulate it, by pulling you back into the role you've always played: the caretaker, the stabilizer, the emotional anchor. This is why the energy can feel intense during this stage. They may oscillate between affection and frustration, vulnerability and entitlement. One moment they're apologetic, the next they're resentful that their efforts aren't immediately rewarded. Because underneath it all is the belief that if they show enough emotion, you owe them re-engagement. But here's the quiet truth. If the connection returns, the desperation fades. And when it fades, so does the performance. The old patterns reemerge because the underlying structure never changed. Accountability was never the goal. Relief was. For survivors, this stage is one of the most dangerous, not because it's aggressive, but because it's seductive. T speaks directly to your hope, your compassion, your desire for meaning and repair, and it can make you question everything you work so hard to step away from. But pay attention to how it feels in your body. Real repair feels grounded, safe, consistent. This feels urgent, pressured, emotionally demanding. It asks you to come back before you're ready, before trust has been rebuilt, before harm has been acknowledged in any meaningful way. This stage isn't about love being rediscovered, it's about supply being threatened. And when you don't respond the way they expect, when you stay steady, when you don't rush back, that desperation doesn't resolve, it mutates, it hardens. And that's when the next phase begins. Because when charm fails and vulnerability doesn't work, the narcissistic ego doesn't surrender, it retaliates. And that's the moment you truly see what your absence has uncovered. When desperation doesn't work, when the charm, the vulnerability, the promises fail to pull you back in, something shifts sharply inside the narcissist. The tone changes, the softness disappears, and what replaces it is not sadness or acceptance, but rage. This is the point where the mask slips because the threat is no longer abstract. Control hasn't just weakened, it's been denied. This is what narcissistic injury looks like when it's fully activated. Up until now, they believed there was still a way to reclaim their position, that if they said the right thing or showed the right emotion, you would return to the role you always played. But when you don't, when you remain emotionally unavailable, grounded, or simply uninterested, the reality becomes undeniable. They are not in charge anymore. And for someone who organizes their entire identity around dominance and superiority, that realization is unbearable. So the psyche defends itself the only way it knows how, by attacking. This is where devaluation begins in earnest. The person who was once everything is suddenly nothing. They may rewrite history, reducing your entire relationship to a series of flaws they now claim they always saw. They may mock your boundaries, minimize your pain, or accuse you of being cruel, selfish, or unstable. This isn't honesty. It's an attempt to restore power by lowering you beneath them. You may notice a sharp increase in hostility or contempt. Sarcasm replaces conversation. Coldness replaces engagement. Or in some cases, rage erupts openly through yelling, threats, or dramatic ultimatums. The message underneath all of it is the same. If I can't control you, I will punish you. This stage is especially painful because it can feel like emotional whiplash. Just days or weeks ago, they were pleading, apologizing, professing connection. Now they act as though you're disposable. This sudden reversal isn't a contradiction, it's a defense. The moment they realize they cannot reclaim control, they flip the narrative to protect their ego. If they convince themselves you were never valuable, then losing you doesn't have to hurt. And often this is where smear campaigns emerge. They may talk about you to others in ways that feel shocking or deeply unfair. They may portray themselves as the victim, you as the aggressor. This serves two purposes. First, it recruits external validation, new supply, to stabilize their wounded self-image. Second, it allows them to offload shame. If enough people believe their story, they don't have to sit with the truth. What's important to understand is that this rage is not strength. It's fragility exposed. Healthy people can tolerate loss, disappointment, and even rejection without needing to destroy the other person's character. This behavior is a sign of emotional immaturity and internal collapse, not power. For survivors, this phase can be frightening and destabilizing. You may feel tempted to defend yourself, to correct the lies, to prove your worth. But engagement here often feeds the fire. Rage feeds on reaction. The less you provide, the more clearly the dysfunction reveals itself. This is also where boundaries are tested aggressively. They may push harder, violate limits, or attempt to provoke you into responding emotionally, because if they can still get a reaction, any reaction, it reassures them they still matter. Your calm becomes a mirror they don't want to look into because it reflects their loss of control with brutal clarity. And here's the quiet truth beneath all of this. They are not angry because you hurt them. They are angry because you are no longer available to be used. You stepped out of the role that propped up their identity, and without it, they feel small, exposed, and powerless. This stage feels loud, chaotic, and cruel, but it's also revealing. It shows you exactly what the connection was built on. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to unsee. Because when someone responds to your boundaries with rage, what they're really mourning is not the relationship, but the power they just lost. After the rage burns hot and loud, something far less visible begins to take place. From the outside, it may look like they've moved on. They may appear unfazed, distracted, even triumphant. But internally, this is where the real collapse happens. Quietly, privately, and often without witnesses. This is the stage most people never see, because narcissists are deeply invested in never revealing what's actually going on inside. Without your emotional engagement, without your reactions, reassurance, or regulation, there is a hollowing out that begins. The internal structure that once felt solid now feels unstable. Narcissistic identity is not self-generated. It's assembled from external feedback, attention, validation, control. When those sources weaken or disappear, there's nothing substantial underneath to fall back on. This is where emptiness sets in. They may feel restless, bored, agitated, or chronically dissatisfied without knowing why. They might describe life as dull or meaningless, even if everything on the surface looks the same. This emptiness isn't sadness in the way most people experience it. It's more like a void, a sense of not being real, not being anchored. And because they lack the emotional vocabulary or self-awareness to name it, they try to outrun it. You may notice impulsive behavior escalate, new relationships that move very fast, sudden obsessions, risk-taking, dramatic reinventions of identity. These aren't signs of confidence or renewal. They are attempts to patch the internal fracture with stimulation, to feel something, anything, that distracts from the collapse happening beneath the surface. What's important to understand is that this fracture isn't caused by you leaving. It was always there. Your presence simply helped conceal it. You acted as a stabilizer, a regulator, a source of coherence. When you stepped away, the cracks didn't appear, they were revealed. And this is deeply threatening for someone who cannot tolerate self-reflection. Instead of turning inward with curiosity or humility, they often double down on avoidance. They seek new supply, not connection, new admiration, not intimacy, because intimacy would require facing the self, and the self feels too fragmented to hold, so they stay busy, loud, distracted, anything to avoid the stillness where the truth lives. This is also why this stage can look deceptively successful from the outside. They may post more, perform more, appear more confident, but this performance is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement, and the moment attention dips, the emptiness rushes back in. For survivors, this phase can be confusing. You might wonder if they're thriving without you, if you imagined the harm, if leaving really mattered at all. But remember this: true stability doesn't need an audience. It doesn't require constant validation, and it doesn't collapse the moment someone disengages. What's happening here is not healing, it's compensation. Internally, there is no integration of what was lost, no accountability for what happened, no grief processed in a healthy way, just a frantic effort to rebuild a false self fast enough to avoid falling into the void. And that kind of reconstruction is always temporary. The most important shift at this stage, though, isn't happening inside them. It's happening inside you. As they fragment internally, you begin to stabilize. The chaos quiets. Your nervous system starts to recalibrate. You feel clearer, calmer, more present. The absence of constant emotional demand creates space for self-trust to return. And that contrast, your growing steadiness alongside their internal instability, is profound. This is the stage where many survivors finally stop wondering why it didn't work and start understanding that it couldn't have worked. Because a relationship cannot survive when one person is carrying the emotional weight for two. Their collapse is internal, ongoing, and unresolved. Your alling, on the other hand, is real. And the moment you stop being the glue that holds someone else together is the moment you finally get to hold yourself. At this final stage, the focus fully shifts, away from their internal collapse and back to something far more important: your liberation. Because while so much attention is often placed on what happens to the narcissist when you give up, the real story is what happens to you when you finally step out of the cycle. This is not a dramatic victory. It's a quiet reclaiming, and it changes everything. For a long time, you were trained to believe that leaving meant failure, that giving up meant you didn't try hard enough, love deeply enough, understand patiently enough. That story kept you stuck. But here's the truth that only becomes clear on the other side. You didn't fail the relationship. The relationship failed you. You were responding to dysfunction, not causing it. When you disengage, something remarkable begins to happen. Your nervous system starts to settle. The constant hypervigilance fades. You're no longer bracing for mood shifts, hidden agendas, or emotional landmines. There's more quiet in your mind, more space in your body. That peace can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because chaos had become normal. But slowly, that calm starts to feel like home. This is where boundaries stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like protection. You no longer need to explain them, defend them, or justify them. You simply live inside them, and the absence of constant emotional negotiation allows your sense of self to reemerge. You remember what you like, what you feel, what you need, not as a reaction to someone else, but as a grounded truth. This is also where guilt may show up. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you were conditioned to prioritize someone else's emotional state over your own. You may still wonder if they're hurting, struggling, or spiraling. And that empathy speaks to your humanity. But compassion does not require self-abandonment. Caring does not mean returning to harm. What's powerful about this stage is that you no longer need them to understand. You no longer wait for validation, apology, or closure. You recognize that closure doesn't come from them acknowledging the damage. It comes from you acknowledging your worth, and that realization is freeing. You also begin to see the relationship more clearly, not through nostalgia or self-blame, but through insight. You understand the patterns, the cycles, the moments where you were slowly trained to shrink, adapt, and carry responsibility that was never yours. And with that clarity comes choice. You choose differently now. You respond differently. You trust your instincts again. This is where real power lives, not in proving anything, not in winning an argument, but in no longer needing to participate. The narcissist's internal collapse may continue, but it is no longer your concern. You are no longer the audience, the regulator, or the emotional scaffolding. You step out of the role entirely. And something profound happens when you do. You begin to build a life that is quieter but richer, slower but more authentic. You surround yourself with relationships that don't require you to disappear to be loved, where connection doesn't come at the cost of your nervous system, where respect isn't conditional. This stage is not about becoming hardened or closed off. It's about becoming discerning. You don't numb yourself. You honor yourself. You don't withdraw from life. You engage with it more honestly. And that's how healing takes root. If there's one thing to remember, it's this. The narcissist loses control when you give up, but you gain yourself. And there is no greater victory than that.